Hey everyone, welcome to my channel, Books, Curves, and Purrs. My name's Wesley, and welcome to my spoiler corner. Today we're going to be discussing Boyle Heights, how a Los Angeles neighborhood became the future of American democracy, and this is by George J. Sanchez, published by University of California Press in 2021. I'm really glad that I read this book. Since it's nonfiction and it seems written in more of like an academic form, it's a bit dense, at least for me. Maybe if you're used to reading nonfiction academia, it's an easier read, but this really took up a lot of my time. Again, I'm glad I read it. I wish I was just more used to this format, because then I probably would have read it a lot quicker. There's a whole section over here that's just references, and in total it's like only 264 pages, 10 chapters. Another holdup in me finishing this is just I found some of the information so fascinating that when I was reading, I would just stop and start Googling some of the references that the author was making. And that also sent me down just, other tangents, made me think about other books I want to read pertaining to just history, whether it's Mexico's or America's, because those are very much interlinked at times, right? And so, yeah, I really enjoyed it. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the intro. I'm going to just lightly go into this. I really, really appreciated the introduction. There's another book, I wish I should have grabbed it. It's called Mexico's Nobody. And I'm going to go grab it. Hold on one second. Okay, I'm swinging back in. By B. Christine Arce. This is also more of an academic piece, and the intro was just so long and kind of made it hard for me to kind of like read further, I guess. I don't know. Maybe it just felt long. It isn't long. And this is also chock full of information, and I'm glad I read it. As you can tell by my tabbies. But I really appreciated the intro by George J. Sanchez, because I felt like it's not just a summary. The author is really talking to the reader and kind of letting us know how they were going to approach each chapter and how they're going to disseminate information. So it felt like prep. And I don't know, I just appreciated their approach to talking to the reader in how we were going to handle all this information going on, because it's a lot. And so with that said, I'm going to refer to my notes. So I might be looking down a lot. I'm going to try not to. So what the author really pointed out is that Boyle Heights for the past 40 years has been largely a majority of Latino population. But once again, it's only the past 40 years. And before that, it was more of a densely diverse neighborhood. And so what the author seeks to answer is, how did this neighborhood lose its dense diversity? That's the best way I could put it. How was that diminished? What are the factors? And so what the author gets to as factors of diminishing diversity is urban apartheid, meaning real estate, lobbying, Jim Crow systems, white flight, the repatriation of Mexican Americans in the 1930s, and internment of Japanese Americans, as well as forced removal for housing and transit development. Similarly, on the opposite side of that is some of those elements, not all of them, of why the neighborhood lost its diversity we also have to think about how did the neighborhood become so diverse in the first place? And some of those really do have to do with racist policies in place, uh, like Jim Crow. People were being pushed out from other areas, and so they were pushed into Boyle Heights because it was seen as it was just viewed as a neighborhood that uh, I don't want to like simplify it, but almost like an eyesore. It was just a neglected neighborhood, so therefore people that were discriminated against found themselves in that neighborhood. And so what happens when that's the setup? How are the people treated? How does a community that's that diverse galvanize, stick together, and so much more that came from that? An example of um, what happens when people are treated like they are, I guess you could say, disposable, which we'll get into later, is that they'll galvanize and they will unionize, they will protest. And so the book also talks about like just the tensions that arose, and how people dealt with that. All right, I'm going to be toggling a little bit here. um, let's see if I can do this book justice. Book 2 is really just like kicking off into the book. Chapter 1 is just the intro. And so what the author talks about are the origins and boundaries of the neighborhood, but America's being, how do I say this, pre-colonial Mexico, I guess, right? Is that how I put it? And how there was the Tongva Gabrielino Indian village of Yang Na, and that in 1781 settlers came in, and the demographic was actually African bloodlines, Indians, and mestizos. And what I really appreciate about this author bringing up right out the gate is that this was or is uh, a place of diversity, right? Some of the, let's say, sometimes like the racist narratives in the States could be, like the whole conversation about who was here first. And that can make people feel like they don't belong, which is what a racist narrative wants to do. And so the way that the author set up these facts of history is something that I very much welcome, and I'm glad to see the author include in their book. So in 1850, California was accepted into the Union, and that right away, early on, there was this division of race, class, and prospects. And so then there was this like battle for land and power. This was done in through what's called grazing rights in the 1800s, which allowed migrants to come in and try to take over land. And that in like 1822, the Spanish finally relinquished their hold over this part of the neighborhood. And until where is it? 1824, Mexico allowed migrants citizenship. So another part of that is that it led to small businesses being established, like wine or selling hides. And in 1848, when Mexico, a U.S. war ended, there was a Treaty of Guadalupe that was signed. And so that is what really hurt the indigenous people of the Americas that were in this part of the States now, because the land was just a land and they just lived there. But now that this part was going to be considered part of the States, there were people coming in and saying like, oh, well, do you even have your papers to show that you own this property? And they never had to have that before. So people lost their like it was the end of the rancheros basically, because they were forced off the land because they didn't have something that didn't even exist, because they lived there prior to. And in 1857, there's someone by the name of Andrew Boyle, who is really responsible for the development of Boyle Heights. They're an Irishman, and they're someone historically, right? They had to deal with their own discrimination from their homeland. But when they found themselves in the States, they aligned themselves with kind of like the racial construct of being white, and took the opportunity with that to also discriminate against others. And I really feel like, or I should say specifically, Blacks and the Chinese population. And that's another element that the author brings. It's not like he just says, okay, this person identified this way. He connects, in doing so, who are they trying to hurt? And that really speaks to kind of like the crab in the bucket mentality of, here's this colonial construct, and instead of working together to get out of it, it's more of a let's hurt others to get on top. And so I appreciated the author kind of bringing that information to light. And in short, in that chapter, the author just brings together like what's going to happen post annexation, the 1870s land grants, 1880s land subdivisions, and residential properties being sold, forcing people out. And then there are the subdivisions of cities and towns being developed. And that's basically where chapter 2 ends. Okay. So then for chapter 3, is that where we're at? Yeah. From global movements to urban apartheid. And so I really appreciated the author bringing up urban apartheid and how is that defined? So in 1920s, there was a great migration of African Americans being pushed into Boyle Heights. That was already a diverse neighborhood. And also what I learned is also that people held on to their roots. So sometimes there's this conversation around like how people need to, what's the word, adapt or kind of like merge cultures. That's fine, but that doesn't mean someone has to let go of their cultural roots. And so what I like the author is also pointing out is that everyone has something to contribute from their own culture, and that should be celebrated. And the author's not writing it that way, but I felt like that was a takeaway, and I appreciated that. So the 1880s through the 1920s, so we're still kind of like staying on top of what the 1920s, is that there's Jewish migrants escaping persecution, the Moluccan people and exiles made their way to Boyle Heights. And so what we're seeing is while some people are being pushed out, people are also being pushed in. And that's a mix of people being discriminated against, and also people that have been exiled from other countries. In this story, I learned about John Wesley Coleman and their family and how they uplifted the African American community. And that was one of those moments where I went off on a tangent and started looking up people in history and how they impacted their community. So not only are people coming in just to find, not just seek refuge, but to make a home, but there's an active choice to be proactive and to uplift others. And so with all this migration to this particular area, what that does is that brings everyone's diverse perspectives, diverse ideologies, and just like John Wesley and their family decided to uplift others, we have people with radical ideologies that come in and such as anarchists, which I found very interesting to read about, that kept capitalism at bay and instead kind of like shifted towards maybe like socialism, or I think just like I think communism and other modes of moving within a society, but to work as a community. And so, with this said, we also have the first Japanese Americans that established Little Tokyo, and this was a great way for community to connect. Another way was the Catholic churches, schools. There's also a Yiddish community, a Jewish community that are building up their own. What do I call it? I'll come back to that. I'm gonna mess it up. Synagogues. I think that's it. Sorry if I'm saying that wrong. My brain just stopped there. But with that said, it wasn't like a perfect community by any means, because people kind of factioned off into their own community at times. There wasn't always inter-community connectedness. So by the 1920s, when we have, let's say, middle schools, high schools, there's a next generation of kids that are spending time together, no matter their cultural or religious ideology, belief systems are different. And there was an effort by the adults in power to separate the kids. There are many instances of kids being told, like, oh, you can't be friends with this person or that person because of their culture, their race, religion, those kind of things were going on. And so then we move on to chapter 4, which is disposable people, expendable neighborhoods. And so in that chapter, there's a 12-year period of repatriation to remove Mexicans in whether or not they're American or not, they're forced removal back to Mexico. And there's also Japanese American internment camps that took place. So those are instances of there's a community at play there, and then through executive action and what's it called, racist laws being enacted or enforced, that people are now being removed, and that would contribute to the density of diversity starting to be chipped away at. So in the 1930s is kind of like a broad timeline that's going to bunch together, but I'm going to take a step back and just say that the LAPD were so preoccupied with the Red Scare, scared of communism, the Jewish population, that in conjunction with that, there was a lot of scapegoating. And so that's also what led to Mexican Americans going into hiding out of fear of deportation. So because of everything that was going on, FDR was someone that was put into power, and Boyle Heights, their population voted for them, in support of them, because they understood that all the scapegoating was just about the economics of that were going on, whereas really just about actually corporate greed, and that there's a population that was used as a scapegoat. And when this is all going on, I also appreciated how the author pointed out that the Mexican population was also treated like all they were capable of was to, in the workforce, was to be labor. So then that's what the kids were pushed towards, even though anyone's capable of doing anything for employment, right? But there is this racist, not just a narrative at play, but trying to perpetuate that, right? To use a group of people as labor. And so when all this is going on, that gave birth to industrial unionism, people getting together, galvanizing, because they're tired of how they're being treated, but also labor is needed and agriculture needs to be taken care of. But the people that were working in agricultural labor were not being taken care of. And so that really pushed for unionization to happen. So another important figure that I was glad to learn about was John L. Lewis, who was someone that helped Mexican Americans galvanize, help them get promotions in the workforce, and just really try to help the roadblocks for being treated like they're only meant to be the help, and also just to reclaim dignity, reclaim their humanity that had been stripped away by society. But then the other hurdle is that federal officials were pushing for public funding for better neighborhoods. When they say better neighborhoods, they don't really care about the people. They care about pushing out people. It's what I would equate it to, like a beautification program. And what we see is time and time again, people being removed and implementing things that are supposed to be good for the neighborhood, but really it's not. And to add to that, it's basically about who's diversing versus underserving the poor community. So it's just so then it's people are treated like citizens versus illegals, which is a narrative used to this day. And then with that said, what I really appreciated about what the author does is that every instance of these practices of removal, of treating people like they're disposable, ultimately what happens to one community happens to another. And it almost seems like laboratory practices of like, we're going to figure out how to hurt this group through discrimination, racist policies, over policing, removal. And then once they learn what worked in hurting one group, they take that knowledge to hurt another. So then what happens? We get Japanese American internment. And so although that is specific, there are all these familiar elements of what was done to hurt people before. And so then we go on to chapter 5, which is Witness of Internment, which covers the reshaping of labor force by World War II, a community reeling from the Japanese American forced removal. And so what really stood out to me is, although I just spoke about like seeing the patterns of the oppressor onto the oppressed, that is what people in real time are witnessing, taking that knowledge and assessing. And more specifically, an example could be the Jewish community. They've already been through so much, and what they're seeing is in real time that whether someone is a citizen or not, it really shouldn't matter. People shouldn't be treated that way. They're seeing that their rights could be stripped at any moment. And so neighbors, so many things happen. Some neighbors like witnessed what was going on and felt helpless. There are letters documenting that time. People would write to their neighbors, even if they weren't like close. Some of them were close, some of them they weren't. They just wanted to make sure another human being that they saw stripped away into in camps. It's almost like they just wanted to make sure that they were alive. And so there were letters going on. And if you're interested in this topic, at least for the state of California, there's a Japanese American museum. I'll put a link in the details below if you're interested in checking them out. I'm sure there must be other museums of the sort that also covers this topic. Something else, there's a couple of other things that happened during this time. Not only were people losing their businesses, but people were forced to sell their property for very little money. They didn't have a choice. They were being removed. No one knew what tomorrow was going to hold. And so that was just going on with their personal property and their businesses. And some people did their neighbors a favor, if you could call it that, and would, like, let's say, live at their home while they weren't there, just hoping that no one would take it over. People lost their family photos. They lost really their livelihoods. They lost so much. And with all this going on, around that same time, I'd say in like 1943, there's also the rise of, I guess you could say, the Zoot suit. I don't know if I could consider that a movement, but that's where Mexican American youth would dress up in like these suits, and I've seen photos, but really a lot of that influence goes back to the African American community. And since Mexican Americans were targeted, for instance, there is this racist narrative that crime had increased and it was the Mexican Americans, when actually statistically, crime was down. But that's not the narrative that was being put out to the public. And so there was just so many attacks by the police that there was a riot that took place in 1943 because of this, because it got so bad. And that was proliferated from false accusations against youth that either ended up serving prison time even though they didn't do the crime, or there was like a case of some youth going to what I would call like a corrections facility, which reminded me of similarly, I know it's not the same, but residential schools, or I just read that book, The Reformatory, and Tenerife Du writes about a fictional horror narrative about something that happened in real life to one of her relatives, of being put into this correctional school, which is actually just another way for kids to be abused, really. And from there, we go on to chapter 6, which is the exodus of the East Side. So what happens is there's this exodus of the Jewish population, not all, but a majority, due to Jewish people being accepted in the States to whiteness and to whiteness ideologies. And so then the geography changed. There was, I think there's this area in Los Angeles, Fairfax. I'm over here now, so there is a large Jewish population, and there are people that are Jewish that stayed in Boyle Heights that rejected that ideology, and did not want to be a part of it, and instead embraced the diversity of their community and worked to I don't want to say collaborate, but work to stay together. But that was also really difficult because then the Jewish population didn't have many people to connect with within their own Jewish community because so many of them left. So it also made it really hard to stick around, because if you think about it, if you migrate to an area, you start small businesses, bakeries, a place of worship, a place of local community, and then a large portion of that population leaves. It's like, how is a person going to keep their business running if you relied on people within your own community, within your ideologies to show up and for each other, and then that no longer happens. And so what we see is by the time 1950 hits, so much of the Jewish population has left. And I'm going to go ahead and quote page 156 as the author writes, "As the 1950s continued, however, the whitening process of suburbanization made it harder for Boyle Heights Jews to reconcile their profound desire for a community that could be both Jewish and multiracial with their own personal futures," which then leads us to chapter 7, which is Edward R. Roybal and the Politics of Multiculturalism. So Edward Roybal was an important political figure. They were the first Mexican American to serve on the Los Angeles City Council in the 20th century, and the only Mexican American to hold a major elective official in the state of California at large. And so he really was a mover and shaker of his time. He and other political figures and people in their community really pushed for more accessible public housing and just to fight against police brutality. And ultimately, the way that Edward R. Roybal became into this political arena was because he knew that there needed to be like a multiracial coalition to just help the community survive. And one could only dream of having a community that no longer has to constantly survive, but then at some point just have the opportunity to thrive, actually. And since police brutality continues to be an issue, there was an incident in Los Angeles where like 5 police officers were convicted of assaults. And I did not know this, but this was what the LA Confidential book by James Ellroy was based on. I've seen the movie, I haven't read the book, but I didn't know that there was a connection to that fictionalized movie that I saw to real life events in Los Angeles. So what I appreciate learning about Roybal is that in the 1950s, there was this ordinance that they're trying to pass to have people that are communist register, which is very dangerous. And so he was the only member that was holding things up and voted against this. And ultimately, he was concerned about thought control. And I just thought the phrasing of that was so important. And I mean, there's so many fictional books written about that concept. And also, there are so many times in real life history present of people trying to control others. And I just thought that, wow, this guy's pretty amazing that he found himself constantly in a lonely position in a way to buck against what people, the majority favored. And so later on, there is this need to defend a neighborhood from redistricting, redevelopment. There's another really important part of history that I feel like isn't really known, I feel like, and that's specific to the Los Angeles area. And so the author does talk about this, and I have another book that I'm in the middle of very slowly listening to the audio version of, and that is a forced removal of people that lived in Cesar Chavez Ravine in order for the Dodgers Stadium to be put there. And so I'm going to read you like a little, like a sentence. So it says, on the land of Chavez Ravine, taken from residents who had been promised public housing. Indeed, the first live telecast of local news in Los Angeles history became the 1959 broadcast of the forced removal of the Arachiga family from their Chavez Ravine home to make way for the bulldozers that would clear land for Dodger Stadium. And I just think that's it's important because I feel like I don't even know a lot. I know what happened. And the only reason why I even know that is because that actually happened to my grandparents. But they just it's more of like a matter of fact thing. And they don't really go into it. And I don't want to like poke the bear and ask too much. So I just kind of wondered, I thought, oh, shouldn't there be a museum or something? Maybe not a museum, but like a center showing what happened. I mean, the Dodger Stadium is there anyways, so I just don't want that history to be forgotten. And so that's another reason why I love writers so much, right? They keep parts of history alive rather than that history being buried. And that leads us to chapter 8, which is Black and Brown Power in the Barrio. And so this covers 1950s, 1960s political responses, City Councilman Edward Roybal students-led walkout of 68, which is really important. I believe that was in East Los Angeles, which is, in the Boyle Heights area. So what we see in the community is that there's an impact of the African American community about attitudes of self-worth, political activism, racial pride. And with that, we also see people that in this neighborhood witnessing that there were the Watts riots, and that led to youth galvanizing, or what's considered to be radicalized around civil rights. And so, even though it's the Mexican American community, the youth that stood up and performed a walkout, what I appreciate what the author is pointing out is that it's not just one cultural group or one racial group that's pushing for uh, equal rights, and that sometimes as history goes on, there's kind of like this oversimplification of who's pushing for equality. And so when we view what happens at the East Los Angeles schools in that area, Roosevelt High School, all these, actually a lot of schools in Los Angeles area pushing for equal rights, that it's just not one group, it's different groups, a diverse group coming together to make these protests take place. For instance, on page 205, it's written that the students demanded compulsory bilingual bicultural education to be provided and requested that all administrators and staff become proficient in Spanish. They wanted relevant textbooks and curricula, and they demanded that Mexican American administrators be appointed at schools where Mexican American students were in the majority. A structure of teacher accountability was also high in their list, including the publication of every teacher's ratio of failure per students in their classroom, as well as the removal of all administrators and teachers who displayed prejudice against Mexicans or Mexican American students. And so what I like about that is that, yes, that was a specific issue culturally, but once again, it was not only the Mexican American community that were pushing for those changes. And so, yeah, I just thought that was really fascinating about how people galvanize. Something else that was really unfortunate about this time is that there was a negative consequence to protests. The youth may have been the ones out there, but it was the adult parents that would receive death threats, and I mean, it drove certain parents to even go back to drinking. So they were just these very brutal real life consequences to the students just that wanted better care, equal rights, better education. And this also motivated some of those students to be lifelong activists. And so I'm going to try to wrap up soon. We're almost done. Just very briefly for chapter 9, creating sanctuary, what we see is that there's this attempt to dismantle unions, which then made an opportunity for employers to give employees low wages. And then we see another wave of discrimination, because what happens is it's not enough money to survive, and then people that are trying to survive, like let's say migrants, take the jobs because they need it. So then that creates a false and racist narrative that migrant community are taking jobs, when that's not it. There is a system in place to make that narrative happen in the first place. And if employers actually just paid their employees living wages, they would have stayed with a job. They would have been able to survive. But once again, there's just a migrant community that gets scapegoated and harmed. And also in doing so, at some point, just like there's a repatriation of Mexican Americans at some point, there was an attempt to create something like that once again. So then we kind of trying to wrap it up really quick. There's chapter 10 is Remembering Boyle Heights, and we step into the conversation of gentrification, low income versus high income, the Latino population, community organizing to push for policy to be inclusive. And so what we see time and time again through history to present time is that there needs to constantly be this galvanizing of community, just being proactive, engaging in activism. If you can't do that, be an advocate. So although it's largely a Latino community now, there's this class issue. There's another generation of Latinos that are coming back to Boyle Heights, East Los Angeles area, and they're actually it's kind of like still participating in gentrification in a way, and so they're some points are being helpful in the community, other ways they're being hurtful in their community, and so it's like how do we balance this out? How do we create affordable housing so that people that are still in the community long term are not harmed again and again and again. And so then we have community that, for instance, there's a major coffee chain. Well, maybe someone, there actually is an example in this book, will start a coffee shop, but it's a mom and pop shop. And what they're creating is items to sell that are meant to serve the community, has the community in mind, and how does this place still exist in a way that doesn't harm them? And time again, although there is there could be power imbalances from authority, political greed, ladder climbing, and even though there's a pattern of the same type of tactics, it's the people there that continue to push against that. And that has only really happened through the diverse community and learning from each other. And so, yeah, with that said, I absolutely loved reading this book. And I know this is a focus on Boyle Heights and how the radical political activism has kept the community together, and how this all happened with like the neglect and the treating of an area like they're not worth taking care of, and it's an area filled with exiles and people that have been discriminated against in so many other ways that are seeking a safe haven and a place to live. And if there's any takeaway, it's just that like that cannot be acquired through passive existence. It has to take place through active action. And if it's mentionable, it might just be manageable. And so even though we're looking at Boyle Heights, I feel like so much of what happened there is really just like a mitochondria of what's happening at large. And so even if you're kind of interested in how in the States how we got to where we're at now, it's a great place to start. So I'd have to say pick this up. And then of course honorable mention is Mexico's Nobodies, because something that I don't want to keep going on and on because I'll talk forever, but that we could really get into is how both these books talk about how race is construct, who falls into where, when and why, who does that hurt, who does it help, who does it harm, and all that. So I hope you pick Boyle Heights up. 5 stars all the way. It's nonfiction, so it's like not exactly easy to grade, but I found this book incredibly accessible. And so yeah, let me know if you've read this or if you're interested in it. If there's anything else you think I should cover, and I'll look into. But also look in the details below because I'll have references there. So thank you for watching. As always, if you're returning, thank you. If you're new here, like, subscribe, comment below. Again, there's another book that I'm reading that's specific to what happened in Cesar Chavez Ravine. I will be listening to it, and I'll probably just do a short review of it just because there's some overlap over here. Thank you so much for being here. I love you all to pieces. And I'll talk to you later. Bye.